Okay.
Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it is April 9th, 2008, and this is another in our series of Classroom 2.0 Live conversations. And today we have Jane Krauss and Suzie Boss from Reinventing Project-Based Learning, your field guide to real-world projects in the digital age. So welcome, Jane and Suzie.
Hi, great to be here. This is Suzie.
Yeah, hi, this is Jane. It's nice to meet some Classroom 2.0 friends.
And we are recording this session, and we do want to give a shout out to Illuminate for providing this room, this Illuminate office that lets us do this. Also with a reminder that we're trying to make the room available so that if you have a conversation you want to hold or an event you'd like to take place, please email me directly at steve@hargadon.com, and we'll see if we can help that to happen. So Jane and Suzie, why don't we start by having each of you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how it relates to the book. And Jane, could we start with you?
Yeah, Jane Krauss here. I was a classroom teacher for many years, and actually I'm back in a school right now, but I was a special education teacher from high school down through the elementary grades for 10 years, and I really learned the power of precision teaching and good planning because those kids needed the most precise and carefully crafted instruction possible. But at the same time, I felt like there wasn't a lot of opportunity for them to make a lot of choices or drive their own learning or become self-directed. And so when I went into the general education classroom as a 4-5 teacher, I just really kind of both technology and project-based learning were really coming on, and they merged together beautifully for me. So I taught for another 5 years using a variety of hit and miss and finally quite successful strategies, and then I left for work in industry, where I realized that going into another work environment, it's just like when you learn a new language, you understand your own better. You know, you learn French and all of a sudden you understand what a subjunctive case is in English, and that's how it was being in industry. I really kind of had a new view of what education was like. And so I worked at Intel in their philanthropic arm, which was focused on education for a while. And then for the last 2 years, I was Director of Professional Development at ISPE. And I've just had a wealth of opportunities to be able to talk with people around the globe and see projects unfold and learn from the talented educators out in the world. So I met Suzie when I was at Intel, and we've continued working together, and it was our kind of shared passion for this topic that caused us to write the book.
That's great. And Suzie?
Sure, I'll jump in. A little different background in my case. I'm a journalist by training and by trade, and have done all kinds of different sorts of writing, magazine, newspaper, longer pieces. And about 10 years ago, I began focusing more specifically on the world of education. Been a long-time interest. I'd actually been a teacher earlier in life at the community college level, where I worked with journalism. I was the entire journalism department, in fact, at a community college here in Oregon, and worked with students publishing a weekly student newspaper, which is certainly my earliest roots, I guess, in project-based learning. That was quite a long time ago. But about 10 years ago, I started focusing on education in writing and editing, and I worked with the Northwest Regional Educational Lab that's based in Portland. It's a federally funded research lab that does applied research, so it's taking good ideas and putting them into practice. And I had this wonderful role of looking for exemplary teachers from around the Northwest, 5 states from, Alaska all the way over to Montana, down to Oregon, and looking for great successes or strategies or projects that could be shared. So that got me out in the field and a really nice mix of the academic world and practice. And was there, probably 5 years or so doing both magazine and book publishing and writing and reporting and just meeting some fabulous educators. And I wound up going from there to work with the Intel group as well, developing some online content and that got me even a broader view of what's happening in classrooms around the world, because one of my main charges with the Intel project was a daily online feature about a teacher somewhere in the world using technology and using it well and in a project-based setting. So that was called the Intel Odyssey project that I think there were close to 400 stories by the time I was kind of ready to move on. So that got me quite steeped in project-based learning and connected with Jane as well. So we decided to pool our talents and our interests and take on this new project together.
So can either of you give us a brief description of what project-based learning is?
You want to jump in, Jane?
I'll at it. Suzie, you can
Sure.
jump in. I think I'd like to hear what people out listening would say about that also. I think it is based in a constructivist pedagogy, the idea that students are learn best when they are driving their own learning, and that there's some that they are given some control over what they do. It's also got degrees of authenticity, or at least at the kind of other end of the spectrum, a sense of simulation of authentic experiences, and it causes kids to learn content matter, as well as the kind of important skills that we know everybody should have, kind of that 21st century school set of collaboration and time management and communication and all those things. And also those kinds of aptitudes that you can't get at any other way but with projects, of kids learning persistence and a sense of where they are within their learning and being able to negotiate their own learning path. And I just think it kind of mirrors what learning in real life is like, more than it mirrors what we think of as traditional education. I see that Steve Ransom is saying that messy problems are desirable, but not as easy, and that is one thing we talk about in the book, is this idea of setting up projects with optimal ambiguity, so that you've got a good through line in a project that drives kids toward the important learning aims you have, but at the same time there's enough optimal ambiguity where they can find their way into the learning and through the learning and are making choices along the way. So Suzie, what else would you say?
Oh, I think another kind of quality we looked for were, as we talk about this, are projects, not projects that are kind of an add-on once the official learning is over with, and then you do a project to kind of celebrate or reinforce learning. The projects really are the curriculum in the instance we're focusing on and what we're trying to encourage. So I guess that would be one other quality. And then the kind of what takes us off in a new direction. I mean, that's kind of been what project-based learning has been all about, for a good while now. There's probably a good 15, 20-year track record of PBL and some good research about what it does to engage students, and in some particular ways, there have been some strong results in the world of mathematics with students actually mastering content and holding on to content, and really understanding it better through projects. But we were noticing through just Web 2.0 availability and accessibility, some new angles where the collaboration is much more global than it was even just a few years ago. So that was another kind of exciting element that we felt like we were kind of early on getting to recognize and see some of those terrific global projects come together.
So
yeah,
we're getting a question already.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jane.
I was going to comment too. R. Martin. He asked, what would you suggest new teachers, how they begin to plan a project? And one of the things we do in the book is it's got a real strong instructional design process mapped out in the book. And there's a difference between planning the course of instruction and planning the learning activity. So one of the things we recommend is that you do start with your standards, but you don't do that laundry list kind of approach where everything's broken down into really small curriculum objectives. You look at the big ideas. So in mathematics now, even NCTM is talking about there are 3 big math ideas that kids in middle school should learn. They have to do with algebraic thinking, and I forget what the other 2 are. But I mean, up-level it so that you're really thinking about the most essential learning aims, and that's where you start. And people say, well, how am I going to meet my standards and have kids test if I, don't knock off all these little kind of subordinate content objectives? And I think that if you start with the big picture in mind and you design a robust project, there are going to be so many touch points along the way where those kind of underlying and subordinate skills are going to be addressed. So I think starting with the big idea, and then in the book we kind of go through a process of thinking about what the natural connections are to that idea. So if we're talking about algebra, where in real life are people thinking about slope? Or what are the real connections out in the world? And then how can you operate as if you are somebody who does that kind of work? So how would an engineer have to deal with slope to design something? And that begins to get you thinking about, well, what are the authentic connections? And then sort of the learning activities flow out of that. So that's how I'd start, is thinking what are the big ideas, what are the real-world connections, and then I think the project activities are going to reveal themselves. And I suggest you leave room for kids to be designing, maybe they're kind of parallel with this main project, but giving kids opportunities to select learning activities for themselves or even design them, and then be teaching others as well. So that's a big part of how you get started.
One more thing I would add is that you start with a buddy, especially if you're new to this process. We really encourage teachers to find a colleague to plan a project with, bounce ideas off, so you're not working in isolation. Whether you wind up collaborating as 2 classrooms doing a project together or not, we find that it really helps teachers develop a stronger project plan and have a better chance of succeeding if they have a colleague to think together about project-based learning and how it's going to play out. So early on in the process, we encourage you to be finding some like-minded teachers to talk about your ideas with and do some planning together.
Yeah, we have some suggestions for how you look locally and both locally and out into, social spaces like Classroom 2.0 to find your colleagues. And I read this quote the other day, and it was about writing, but it said, "How will I know what I'm thinking until I can look at it?" And it was about getting your ideas down is the way that you can look at them and have others look at them, so that you're just that much clearer, about what you're trying to accomplish. And just that idea that it takes, more minds on an idea is better than just one. I think that, finding a colleague to bounce ideas around with is helpful, and it's also generative. You'll start thinking of things you might not have on your own.
Jane, we've had a question about special ed students in project-based learning. I know this is an area where you have a lot of expertise, so why don't you take that one?
Oh, I think that's probably one thing when we were asked, how do you define project-based learning? I think that it's a lot more activity-oriented and less of a reliance on reading and writing than other kinds of schoolwork. I guess I shouldn't say less of a reliance on reading and writing, but it's reading for purpose instead of just to complete an assignment. And so making the reading be more meaningful to kids, and they're reading for information or they're writing to communicate to others, I think gives kids the motivation and the kind of that extra boost that they need to kind of stick with those skills that might be hard for them. And they have so many ways to express themselves, I think, particularly as technologies have advanced, that just make project-based learning a beautiful thing. The ability to express yourself artistically and visually and through the spoken word, there's just so many opportunities now that I think that all those modalities we can take advantage of for both learning and for expression.
Is there a difference? Steve Ransom asks, is project-based learning often confused with problem-based learning?
Well,
They're
Suzie,
pretty
don't
close
you think
cousins.
that, yeah, and I think that problem-based learning really was the origin of project-based learning. From what I understand, that there was a shift in the way that medicine was taught to medical students, and they decided to do more case-based study, and so students would be given a problem. You know, there's a patient that exhibits these symptoms, here's what you know, what don't you know, and it was more of a, even though it was an exercise, you know, thankfully they weren't having their hands on patients yet, but they got chances to experiment with different kinds of inquiry methods and find their own best way to learn about diagnostic procedures and medicine. So, and I think that that was adopted, and I don't even know when exactly, but that was kind of adopted, that approach.
Oops. Are we still there? Some audio trouble?
I was having trouble with the audio there for a minute. Not sure if you can hear me now.
Are we all back again? Steve, are we there? Uh-oh.
Hi, so this is Steve, and I've made some administrative moves here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay, so there was some feedback, and what I did is I turned Karen's mic off. Karen, it looked as though you turned your mic on and created some feedback. So if you do want to chime in and turn your mics on, if you'd click the little hand button underneath the participants, that you can raise your hand, and then we'll pull you in and make sure there isn't any feedback. So Jane, sorry that you got interrupted there, and Karen, no fault of yours, but just the nature of the technology.
If Jane was just talking about project versus problem-based learning, and one of the other differences is that the problem approach is very much a teacher-designed or instructor-designed problem. Project-based learning is going to be a little bit more open-ended, wouldn't you say, Jane, in terms of what sort of outcomes or final products might come out of it, what sort of evidence of learning is going to be the result? There's more flexibility on the other end.
Yeah, and I think in problem-based learning, it really is serving more as an exercise, and we're thinking there's more on you know, we're not operating on people, which is great, but there's more authenticity in, and there's more room for individual decisions, you know, students making decisions about their learning path. And I just think, you know, that those are the kinds of kids we're wanting to produce, ones who are self-directed and know what they know and what they don't know and how to get what they need. And I just think project-based learning, I think, encompasses those things more than problem-based learning does.
So there was another good question that came up. I'm scrolling back from R. Martin. Where can we direct elementary teachers who would be new to this concept to find ideas?
Well, once they finish our book.
Short answer. There's a book you may have heard of.
That was kind of a setup question, wasn't it?
No, but I think another really great resource that, after you've read the book, a great resource is the George Lucas Education Foundation, GLEF, and Edutopia, and they've just done an amazing job with really documenting with lots of multimedia what project-based learning looks like. And so if you're trying to help people get a picture, it's a nice site to go to because you can watch video together and talk about it, and there are lots of good readings, and it's a good way to start. Another way to start, and we recommend this in the book, is to join a project that's already in action. Maybe the whole instructional design part is a little daunting when you're just getting started, and so why don't you join a collaborative project? There are lots of them out there. Global SchoolNet, ePals, a lot of organizations host projects, and you can get involved, and that's a good way to get your feet wet.
So is the reinventing part of the project-based learning book because of Web 2.0?
I think so. I mean, I think it's what Web 2.0 allows, and particularly the sort of global collaboration that it allows. Don't you think, Jane?
Yeah, and I think that the technologies cause something to happen that, for instance, I think that any good work is iterative work, you know, so if kids are honing something and taking it as close to perfection as they can, we can do that with technology now. Instead of, you know, lots of drafts or drawing the same thing over and over and trying to, you know, achieve perfection, that iterative quality of having technology is really helpful. One of the things we talk about in the book are the essential learning functions of technology, and there are so many technologies out there now, and there are so many coming on that there's no way we can ever describe all of them. We describe a lot of them in the book and how to use wikis and things like that, you know, but we say that we decide to parse it out and say there are about 8 essential learning functions of technology that really support project-based learning, and they include things like iterative work, like I was just talking about, being able to make things visible and discussable, communication and collaboration in ways you couldn't do before, deep learning with real-time data sets and primary sources. All these things, these essential learning functions can be met with a lot of different tools and websites, but we think that those are kind of the underpinning of good project-based learning, and an awful lot of it is really new. We couldn't do it before we had these technologies.
Do you have a list of those 8 essential learning functions on the blog site?
I think that appendix is on our wiki, and we could.
And there's a link to the wiki, Susie, on our website on the blog. There's a link to the wiki down at the bottom of the page on the right, Steve.
Am I getting close?
And you just passed it, I think. It is.
Oh, did he?
I think so.
When people are having to look at this render poorly, one thing I'll talk about is the blog, where we kind of keep the story going about project-based learning. So we've got lots of classroom examples and just some reflection on what we're seeing out in the world. So we encourage you to go to the Reinventing PBL blog.
Right. I think you're right there now.
Stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where is it?
See where it says news or transcripts? Steve, on the right, next to Tuesday, April 1st?
Yes.
That news or transcripts link? If you dig in there, there are different events we've done, and they there are wiki pages that have lots of attachments and things like that, and I think there's an attachment to the essential learning functions there. I can append it somehow too, if you'd like.
Yeah, if I can find the link, I can put it in the chat room.
Okay. It's probably on this first one, guided exploration of the topics addressed during this session, the content and tools. Which one's the more recent?
Let's see. It should be. There we go. Essential learning functions.
Oh, there it is. Essential learning functions.
Right there. Yeah, there's the excerpt of the book right
there.
Too. The PDF would give you a little bit longer view of it.
And what we did is, I think it's chapter 3 where we talk about the essential learning functions, and we look at them kind of briefly, but then we have an appendix, because the appendix A of the book, that really goes into quite a bit of detail. I think the appendix is something like 15 pages long, where we just say, you know, this, and we like to think of this appendix as being kind of hot swappable, because even though we think that these functions are stable and really important, we know the tools are changing all the time, and so we'd love your input on what you think. No, have you heard about DIGO, you know, or because one of our sections is, one of the essential learning functions is project management. So we talk about Delicious, but we haven't talked about DIGO yet. So as these tools come on, we would love to refresh this thing with your help.
And I think VoiceThread is another one that slipped by us before our deadline for publishing. But we talk about making things visible and discussable. But it wasn't until after the book was already to print that we knew about Voice Through Ed and how it was the possibilities that offered. So the tools are going to continue to evolve and get mashed up, and new ones coming online. But these functions we think are pretty stable in terms of what some of the big goals you're going to need to accomplish with technology are going to be in the project-based learning kind of a classroom.
So one question or comment that has appeared in the chat room is from Chammy5. I just joined because I was actually looking at this book to see if I could use it to help teachers that are completely new to Web 2.0.
I think there are some killer apps in Web 2.0 that I think everybody should know about, and we gave them a pretty good treatment in the book, sort of an expanded treatment. Things like Delicious, blogs, wikis, what else? But if you're wanting people to just get started with Web 2.0, I think that there are some fundamental applications like those I mentioned that are not going to go away, and they're the first ones people ought to kind of wrap their minds around. So one thing I think that's different about our book than some others I've seen is that we talk about those tools within the learning context. We don't just go into a big treatment of what they are and how they work. We think you can get that elsewhere, but we contextualize their use, and I think that's key. I get tired of seeing a tool and I leave not knowing how I'd use it. So I think that, so I'm saying that, I think it could be a useful way to learn about those tools.
Karen asks, what role do you see libraries playing in assisting teachers in schools getting up to speed with web tools?
Oh, we love librarians and media specialists. I think they play an essential role here. I think in potentially being collaborators with teachers looking to develop projects, or stepping in at really critical points during the lifespan of a project, where they can bring resources or ideas to students to help them with their research process as they're answering questions and looking for answers, or getting familiar with new kinds of information, their information literacy skills. There's some great examples in the book of media specialists who have teamed up with teachers to develop some really wonderful projects together. So they're a resource that I think every teacher ought to be using as much as possible.
And I think they need the support of information specialists too, because in project-based learning, a lot of times we're asking teachers to teach in a way they never learned themselves, and I think that is a big hurdle to change your teaching pattern. You're kind of, a lot of people are teaching the way they were taught, and so to shift, it's a real paradigm shift, and I think that information literacy is challenging, and if library media specialists can help teachers kind of grasp what they're looking for their own information literacy, kind of building that out, helping them with the new tools that help us kind of parse all the information out in the world, inquiry strategies, search strategies, I think that they're essential.
And I see a little bit more about Karen's background here. So Karen, it sounds like you have a wonderful background and expertise to benefit a lot of teachers if you're helping to connect the richness of National Geographic with Web 2.0. Wonderful. So that sounds very exciting.
So there was a discussion about the book that was held in a Ning Network. Is that a resource that people could go to and actually discover conversations about some of the things you've been talking about?
Sure, they can actually join in. It's ongoing.
They're at about chapter 5 right now, and the nice thing about these Nings is there's this persistence, so you can go back in the discussions and see, well, what did they say about the first chapter? And there's some people who are reading the book all out of order, like you would do, Steve. And you told me that. You said I never read a book from front to back. And
That's
so some people are reading it that way too. So they're kind of bouncing around, but they're generally going chapter by chapter. And they're at about chapter 5 right now. And anybody can join. I think 120 teachers signed up. There are a few that are just really sticking with it and staying with the group. And they're all figuring out together how to do a virtual book group. But it's fun to, it's fun to see. I think it's called you can search the Ning, but it's SIGTE, that's the ISTE Special Interest Group for Teacher Education, so SIG, S-I-G-T-E. You could search that in, Big Ning, and you'd find that group.
And it's
you have it right here, don't
Steve
you,
has it right
Steve?
here, yes. He has the URL right there.
So you can just give the URL. Oh,
wonderful. And then I think the hope with this this discussion group is that it will live on once they're done, talking through this book. There will be some teachers, professional developers, others who will find each other, find like-minded educators who will go on to develop some projects or some professional development resources together, building on kind of their shared conversation. One of the topics where they really dug in, I think, and had the most productive conversation so far, we've been kind of, with their permission, we've been watching from the sidelines mostly, which is wonderful to get to watch this conversation unfold, about something you're quite familiar with.
It's a little disconcerting.
A little bit, but so far so good. But when they talked about the whole, building your professional learning network or professional learning community in a school, how does that work and how does that support curriculum development and project development and all of that? And they just had some really rich, wonderful conversations around that with a lot of good expertise, everyone from, people who were at the university level, helping prepare new teachers, to those who were longtime professional development experts, to those who were in the classroom level. So really rich conversation about that and how that all supports the project approach. And then we had one, can we talk a little about our one exemplar who came out of this group?
Yeah, and there's a link to it right there too.
Yeah, as you see, chat with the authors, and there's Talania Norfar's name, with a link there. She joined us in a Skype conversation that we had with this book group, and we had this wonderful discussion, and towards the end we asked her if there was anything that she was missing or other resources she would have liked to have seen, and she said one thing she would have loved was being able to watch a project all the way from the very first glimmer of an idea through the collaborative planning and, all the way to the end, because we kind of dropped in examples throughout the book where they made the most sense. So we would talk about one aspect of a project in a chapter about collaboration and another aspect of a different one when it was about project management. But she said, I would have loved to have seen the whole, messy process from start to finish. And we said, we would too. How about we use you? And she was quite game and is right in the middle of developing her first collaborative project with 3 or 4 colleagues in her school and blogging about it.
And, and she's very reflective. She just, warts and all, she tells you everything that's going on. It's really kind of like being a fly on the wall. And one of the things I've learned from reading her is what good facilitation means when you're trying to bring a group of teachers together on a project, and she's just a master. I think her reflections on how she's learned to listen and how she lets the process be kind of messy but pulls them all together, and she's just ambitious and confident, and she's really fun to read.
She had a prior life, she told us, as a journalist, so we kind of knew she'd be a good storyteller going into this. And
there are some. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Steve.
I was just going to say, it also occurs to me, and I think maybe you've made this point, that these technologies can also help support teachers in working with each other just to kind of get started and to have places to turn to ask questions and for help.
Sure. I mean, Classroom 2.0 is a great place to throw up a question and get, answers from all over the universe of smart teachers. But there are lots of...
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jane.
We've watched a lot of teachers kind of meet up on Classroom 2.0, and then there's also the Global Education Learning Collaborative, is that what it's called? The other really good Ning for teachers, where it's really about connecting teachers on a global scale in projects, and so we're fine. I've met a few people in Classroom 2.0. I think I met Steve there before I ever met him live, and I felt like I'd known him for a while. And so, I mean, people are making real connections, and and I think they're supporting each other professionally, and it even has kind of that nice social element to it too that kind of keeps you going. I think sites like this for getting things going and meeting people and getting your questions answered, and then also just having a wiki set up to plan a project in that everybody on the team can get into is kind of a key thing. And I think that's what we suggest when you get started with the project is make yourself a wiki, and here's how you do it, and here's why you would, and here's what you put in it. So there are just some tools that do help the project planning and execution process a lot from the teacher side, and then of course there's all the things that kids use.
Mm-hmm. And as another resource for finding colleagues who might share your interests, who might be potential collaborators, we really emphasize the whole blogging community. If you're not an active blogger yourself, you should at least be a reader or a lurker, a commenter. And we know from example after example of great projects that began because one teacher commented on another's blog. I mean, back when Jane and I talked about our previous life doing some work with Intel, and I was focusing on kind of innovative teacher of the day types in this daily feature. Two of the ones that I wrote about several years back now were Will Richardson and Ann Davis, who had just done their very first blogging project together after connecting through, commenting on each other's blogs and going on to do the whole Secret Life of Bees project that's kind of become a landmark, I think, in the history of educational blogging. It's such a well-known story now. And as we were doing right in the middle of the research for this project, the Flat Classroom project was just underway. And again, Vicki Davis and Julie Lindsay now are quite well known for their wonderful project design, but they met again through each other's blogs and having a comment that you can kind of tell when someone is on the same wavelength or shares your interests and makes you think twice, or you get the feeling that this is going to be a thoughtful person you'd want to work with if you had the chance. So example after example like that came through the blogging world. So we encourage teachers to be readers and writers and all of that in that universe.
I put the Global Education Collaborative Ning up for people to see, and then I pasted the link in the chat as well.
Okay. And I see a question here about assessment, which is an interesting one that we often get, and we focus quite a bit on assessment in the book. But Dennis, you're asking about should assessment focus on not just grading the project, but the process? And I think you're absolutely right, because the process is where teamwork, leadership skills, all those kinds of things come into play. Project management, being able to pay attention to deadlines, manage your own learning, ask questions, all those kinds of things happen in the messy middle of the project. So it's both formative assessment there, and Jane, you might want to talk a little bit about different strategies for assessing the project in process. It's a really good point.
Yeah, I think that some of the onus for assessment actually lies with kids, and I think that some of the best projects have kids writing, keeping reflection journals on their own processes, and that's something that, again, it's a way to get ideas out so everybody can look at them and talk about them. So I think that's just a nice process in any project. One of the things that I imagine is when you're at the front end of a project, you're planning what those essential learning aims are that you're going to meet, and you're going to imagine, and this is from the backward design process, from Understanding by Design, from the Buck Institute. Everybody, the biggest thinkers on project-based learning, say when you start with the end in mind, then you know what it would look like if kids were able to create or do or say, tell you. And so if you line out your learning objectives, you'll be able to build rubrics that capture the learning both in a formative way as it unfolds and in a summative way at the end. And so I think that any rubric would have several parts. One would be the content knowledge, what kids understand at the end of the project and what they're able to do in terms of their skills. Then there's also those 21st century skills that we talk about, being able to communicate, negotiate, things like that. And then there's those learning dispositions that we touched on a little bit of, are they becoming more persistent? Are they able to reflect on their own learning? Are they able to take a risk? You know, and so if you know those projects are going to call on those things, then you build a rubric that addresses not just the skills and the content knowledge, but also those learning dispositions. And then, you know, we have a really good example. There's a guy, you might have heard of this project. It's called Google Lit Trips. And actually, I met Jerome Berg, the author of this project, when he was just putting it together when he was part of the Google Teacher Academy. And it's a project where now kids are illustrating them themselves, where they take any kind of road literature from the Aeneid to the Grapes of Wrath, where somebody moves across a place over time. And in Google Earth, they illustrate and they describe and they summarize and they do all that good stuff with literature using place marks on a route on Google Earth. And so people have asked him, they've challenged him, well, how do you know your kids really know Grapes of Wrath? And he says, well, I just do because of what they're able to show me in their work. You know, their products are the assessment in themselves. And but at the same time, he said, you know, I kind of stuck in my craw a little bit, so I decided to just pull up my old assessments of Grapes of Wrath and ask other teachers who teach it, just send me what you know, your end of the unit, end of the book test. Just give them to me. And without telling his kids they're going to do this or anything, he just gave them the tests. And he said they outperformed anything he had ever imagined they would be able to do when he was just teaching it the old way. And so I think that kind of the lesson is that they not only knew the book and could answer those kind of discrete questions that are on an end of book test, but they'd really kind of I don't know, consumed the book and it became a part of them in a way, you know, that they're going to have memories of that book. So there's all this stuff beyond what they were able to do on the test. They've got pictures in their mind of what a dust storm looks like because they put video into the, you know, place marks that showed authentic video from dust storms in the 30s. They just had really embodied the book. And so I think there are different ways to go at assessment, but he was pleased that he was able to show that even taking a traditional assessment he was able to test sort of non-traditional instructional practices with good results.
We also, throughout the book, we showcase a few examples of model schools or school districts that have really embraced well, they kind of have the environment where project-based learning, very rich project-based learning with technology can thrive. So they have kind of some of those qualities in place. One of them is the New Technology Foundation's the New Tech High School in Napa and the schools that are related to it through the New Tech Foundation. And they have quite an interesting and robust assessment model that they use, their online grade books and the ways that students get feedback both throughout a project and at the end of it. You know, multiple grades on a project, not just kind of one grade that tells you overall not a whole lot, you know, either you did well or you didn't do well, but it doesn't dig much into specifics. And so they talk about, you know, how they break a project down into the different categories that where they want to see students succeed.
Shall we answer a question or two? I see.
This might be a good time to actually allow people. This might be a good time to allow people to actually take the mic if they'd like. You can do so by raising your hand. There's no little hand icon, and then we'll tell you you can grab it, or if you're proactive now, just click on the Control plus F2 or the mic button at the bottom, and if you wanted to ask a question rather than type it, you're welcome to do so. There is a question here from Chami5 again. How do you address access issues when developing these projects? I often hear, we'd like to do this, but we have too many kids who don't have access.
Does that mean outside of school access?
I think that's what it means.
Why don't we have her take the mic if she has one and just explain a little more?
Yeah, does this work?
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yes, great.
Sorry, this is the first time I ever do this. Yeah, we have, it seems that a lot of the teachers that I talk to, and I'm trying to get involved in this, they keep saying, oh no, we can't do that because too many kids don't have access outside, our ELD kids can't do it, or, and I don't know if it's truly, I have kids too that don't do their homework, most of them don't, but it just seems that you should get past this, having them do it in class or figuring out other ways. So do you have better ideas than maybe I do at this point in how to address this with teachers that are supposed to be using technology?
It's I almost, this is probably a snide comment, but I think if it was a question of access, then it would be something else. If somebody is just kind of reluctant. But about the access thing, I think one of the things that projects kind of force us into thinking is that not all the kids have to be doing the same thing at the same time. And one thing I've heard people say is, well, I only have 4 computers in my classroom, so I really can't do these technology, projects that use technology. And it's like, well, in a project approach, and probably in any good constructivist classroom, kids are engaged in different things at different times, and whether you're having kids rotate centers on a schedule or whether they have just-in-time access to technology as they need it, I think that the classroom access issue of not having enough computers is one you can address by imagining kids doing different things at different times. The home access thing, I think it'd be great if we started thinking of school differently, that it wasn't an 8 to 4 enterprise where everything gets locked up. And I know there are restrictions to how you keep a computer lab open or something like that. But I think that if we started thinking of a school as being a learning resource center where all kinds of people can come and learn, it'd be great. I also think we don't make as much use of the public libraries as we could, and we don't send technology home with kids like we could. I know one of the some of the laptop initiatives where they have one-to-one access is so that kids do have sort of ubiquitous access and they're taking computers home. But I'm not sure there aren't reasons why other schools couldn't send laptops home with kids. I mean, there's security issues and insurance issues probably, but I think there are ways that we could get it done.
Right. We also take a look at resources more broadly, not just technology access, which is an important resource, we agree. But at the very start of this whole process, we encourage you as teachers, members of your learning community, of your school, to think about what resources do we have at hand, what's available to us. And we really encourage you to think broadly about that. We introduce an activity called asset mapping that kind of has a whole long history well outside the classroom in community development. But it's a way of talking about if we have a class of, say, 25 students, each of them comes from somewhere. Their families, their guardians are connected to talents and resources, everything from, who in this class has home computer access. So if you're dividing up teams, you want to make sure that there is someone with access in every team maybe. But there are other ways to think about resources as well in terms of the talents and skills that are available to tap in your classroom. So that's another strategy. And then we share in the book a couple of examples that if you think that, I just couldn't do this because we only have 1 computer or 2 computers or something. It'll never happen, or we don't have enough access at the library or whatever. One of the most inspiring examples that we share is a teacher in the Philippines who truly has, the ratio is 1 to 60. 1 teacher, 60 kids. And I've actually visited some of the schools there and have seen this. It's remarkable to see coming from the U.S. But she was a wonderful problem solver in terms of finding computer access for kids in internet cafes and making sure that it was going to be very safe and that there was, adult supervision so there weren't concerns that way. But there are ways around lack of access. And as Jane said, access doesn't have to be continuous. You can plan for occasional access now and then. It doesn't have to be every day, every hour.
Well, I just wanted to say I love all the ideas of people far away who can do it. Well, here in California, in San Jose, where we're in the middle of Silicon Valley, this is always the excuse. And so yes, I have opened my lab after school and inviting people. They're just not coming, but eventually they will. And I love this forum because it gives me hope. I just think I just keep on plugging away, and I really appreciate your response here.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. I think hope is a big one. You can't do without that.
We've kind of looked at the teachers who do take on projects, and they have some qualities they share, and you might be able to imagine what they are, but there's this, they're lifelong learners, they're willing to learn something new, and they're even willing to teach in a way they were never taught themselves, which is pretty big risk-taking. They're ambitious, they're confident that their kids can do this and that they can too, and there's just this sort of optimism that that we really like. And I've started thinking that one of the best things we can do for the other, I don't know, I won't name a percentage of teachers who don't really want to get involved in this, is that we can help them understand that the risks aren't that big. We can show them by example, and so we can kind of, I think another one of the qualities of projects in this day and age, one of the kind of things that reinvent project-based learning, is the fact that we can kind of share our stories in new and better ways than we ever could before. Classroom teaching can be kind of an isolating experience, and if we can learn from each other and showcase what we're doing, I think it just sort of, and sort of that Talania does it. She's got this real warts and all kind of blog going about how the project is unfolding that she's doing with her school, and I think it lets people know that, people didn't have these bright, shiny projects from the start. There's a lot of trial and error. There were things where they messed up, but they just kept going. We have a few questions that are kind of getting lost, I think, in the flow here, from Allison and Maureen and a few people. I wondered if they'd like to chime in or ask again. There's a question about security issues.
PBL for language learning.
Yeah, PBL for language learning. Steve, how do we handle this with 7 minutes left? Can we go longer, or do we just try to knock these out?
Well, you can go as long as you like, and people can leave when they want to leave. So I would say just keep going, and you'll know when it's time to finish. And you can scroll up to look at those questions. I'm sure you know that. Now, Michael Stagen had a number of comments, and I wonder if Michael might want to get on and talk a little bit about that.
Oh, there he is. I'm not sure he has a mic.
Well, I'm not so sure you were rambling, Michael, because it did seem like you maybe addressed the Maureen question a little, and I'd be interested in hearing what Jane and Susie would have to say about that. Maureen's question was, or concern was, it sometimes seems that something that starts out as a project-based experience.
Oh.
Hi, Michael.
There's Michael. Hi, Michael.
Oh, hey, all I have to do is press a button. It's pretty easy.
There you go.
So, Jane, I don't know if you remember, but Michael was in San Francisco for that workshop.
Oh, okay. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Jane.
I'm right about that, aren't I, Michael?
Yeah, I was there. I gave the presentation on Facebook.
So it occurred to me that you might be able to kind of touch on the question that Maureen asked. It sometimes seems that something that starts out as project-based experience, whether it's online or not, falls apart into cute little activities which don't really relate to any essential questions. And it seems like maybe your previous comments were addressing that.
Okay. Well, the first thing I would say is that that you definitely have to break down big projects into much smaller activities and pace them to make sure that students are actually coming along with you through the project. Otherwise, there won't be a lot of participation at the end, and that will kind of catch you by surprise. I guess if you begin with the end in mind, as has been said, and you know where you're going, and you show your students where you're going and the steps that you're taking to get there, and you definitely have a lot of reflection as you're moving through the project. I don't think that would be as much of an issue, especially after you have gone through and had the experience of a couple big projects that haven't gone very well. But once you get that kind of season under your belt, you definitely get used to that kind of pace and recongregate and move forward. So.
And you know, I think that practice means something because your kids are getting practice too. There's one teacher I'd like to give you the link to from Hannibal, Missouri, and you would look this time of year. It looks like a well-oiled machine. They've been doing projects all year, and but it took a lot of practice for kids too to understand how to negotiate their own learning path because they haven't been asked to do that before. And I think a lot of high schools haven't been asked to do that before. High school kids haven't been asked to do that before. So it's kind of a new learning environment for kids, and they're learning the project approach right along with you. Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just going to say, I would add that as a teacher, when I reflect on every time I tried something new, including teaching, I definitely failed the first time around, and there would definitely be no teachers doing anything cool if they hadn't suffered through that first time with their students of trying to feel out what they were doing.
Right, and that's just part of that's part of real life, and that's something they have to get ready for. That things don't always unfold according to plan. Sometimes readjustments are necessary. But your other point that a big project, you don't do it as a whole piece. You do break a project into smaller components, and you work toward where you want to go in the end. But the key here is making sure that it doesn't turn into just a bunch of kind of little hands-on activities that are interesting and maybe fun, but don't add up to the bigger picture that you really want to get to.
We give an example in the book that draws a distinction between thematic teaching and project-based learning, because thematic teaching has been around for a long time too, probably longer than project-based learning, and people get them confused. And so thematic teaching might be that a second grade class is learning about apples. They count apples, they draw apples, they taste apples, they read Johnny Appleseed, and everything's about apples. But that's not project-based learning, that's thematic teaching. What might make it project-based learning is you find out what are people's preferences for apples and how has that changed over time? How do our apples get from us to the grocery store? How does the grocer make choices about the kind of apples he stocks based on their popularity? How has the price of apples changed over time? I mean, you go into things that are interdisciplinary, that they're connected, and they add up to something bigger. So we kind of do a treatment in the book about the difference between the two because projects aren't trivial, and there are just some pitfalls to avoid in projects, and one of them is just thinking that you're getting at something essential when because everything's on a theme.
Can I ask a question? Would that be all right?
Yeah, sure.
To Jane and Suzie, right?
Yeah.
I guess so. When you talk about these, I guess inquiry-based projects where you're trying to solve a problem or answer an overarching question, what do you see as the role of product-based projects? Whereas there's a particular outcome, and how do you, I guess, balance or intermingle the two?
Well, I think it's great to have a product at the end of a project, particularly if it's a kind of product that kind of is additive, where everybody's contributions are adding up to a big outcome, where everybody's contributed in different ways. And I think that I don't know. I don't think a product is ever a problem. I think we're probably paying more attention to the process than we ever used to. But one of the things about a product is that you think, who's this product for? And that's where you can become very authentic, where you think, who would need to know this? Or what is the purpose of what we're doing? And who does it serve? And who else are we teaching? Or who are we engaging? Or so the product, the choice of the product is key. But I don't think it's a problem. What were you going to say, Suzie?
Well, just the other thing to add, I guess, is all the students shouldn't be imagining exactly the same product that they're going to produce to your, to the teacher's specifications. It shouldn't be quite so clear-cut from the beginning. I think that's part of the what makes projects interesting is that students do have the ability to define kind of what the result of their learning is going to look like and what direction it's going to go. To kind of build on the Apple theme Jane was using a minute ago, I mean, it reminds me of this wonderful teacher in Washington State who works in a very agricultural region where there is a lot of apple growing. It's Washington State after all, and a lot of his students are the children of people who are working in the fields and doing harvesting, and what's gotten them interested is pesticides. And, the end result of their investigation, they were certainly curious, so there was the inquiry, is this harming our parents? We also work in the summers, is it harming us? The end result of their product was some translated labels, warning labels on pesticides in Spanish. And I believe they also testified before their state legislature about, raising awareness of pesticides in the Spanish-speaking community. And those are really powerful products. I don't know that this teacher had that in mind going in, but it's certainly where his students wanted to go and kind of where they wound up. So, giving them room, as one teacher put it, allow room for them to amaze you, because if you give them that opportunity, perhaps they will, and that's pretty great.
Yeah, and I think that the giving kids opportunities to find out what they're interested in and what they really care about is important, and then kind of guiding. I don't know if all of you have, but I've use the know, wonder, learn process, where you introduce a topic and what do we know and what do we want to know and how will we know when we learned it. And it can kind of work, but you're hearing from the kids that are vocal. You don't know what everybody's interested in. You get some really concrete stuff. I know the biggest whale is the blue whale, but it doesn't lead you necessarily to really inquiry kinds of questions. And so we kind of take a run at that no wonder learn process and show teachers and how you can go from the kinds of questions kids have and turn them into real inquiry, so that you can shift from that concrete, I could look it up in a book kind of question they say they want to know more about, and really shift it, like I kind of was trying to do with that Apple example I just gave, into something that really does drive inquiry, because those are the questions that are going to really take you far. And you're going to learn those little discrete skills along the way, or those discrete facts along the way. But so we kind of give this treatment of a no wonder learn process, where you're kind of watching a teacher shift kids' thinking so that it's to more of a true inquiry. Because nobody knows how to do this. Kids haven't been asked to do it before, and so they have to learn that there's a difference between the kinds of questions that I'm usually asked to ask and the ones that really take me on an investigation.
Let's take
Allison. Can I comment on Allison really quickly? Allison makes the point that open-ended projects doesn't preclude the teacher from showing a model product. I think that's a really good point, that you could say this is one way this might turn out. Is great. The other thing that project-based learning doesn't preclude, and sometimes people feel like, oh, I can't ever teach a discrete lesson because it's project-based learning. The kids are the people doing the work, and I'm the guide on the side. And I think that there's an interplay between project-based learning that's very student, directed, but then the need for that really well-designed just-in-time lesson that keeps kids going on to the next stage, or gives them that discrete knowledge that they need to know to move along in a project. So I think the having model products is great, and I also think that teachers inserting themselves into the process is great too.
And I think, one other thing happens in schools that embrace project-based learning is not that there's going to be one example or one model product to show, but there becomes kind of a whole culture, so that this evidence of really interesting project work and student investigations is kind of helps define the place. It gives a whole flavor. This is kind of what we're about as an institution of learning. We do these kinds of things. And so that kind of builds more interest, I think, in students getting a chance to, for their turn to take part in those kinds of learning activities.
Yeah, and I think that the collection of artifacts is going to be helpful. Like maybe you show a model product the first time as something that you mocked up, but over time you'll be collecting kids' work, and you'll be able to show authentic work that kids have produced over years. And it makes me think also that you're going to be building a tradition and an expectation in your school for this kind of learning among kids and families. And the community, and that's just a beautiful thing. The more you use your projects, the less kind of heavy lifting for you, and the more that you've built a tradition for learning this way in your school.
Are we reaching that point, Steve, you think? Or are there more questions out there? We haven't.
We'll do the formal wrap up, and anybody who wants to can stick around for a few minutes. So our thanks to Illuminate for providing this platform. This turns out has been just such a good experience the last few weeks using Illuminate to do this. Encouragement to anybody who's interested in hosting or holding this kind of discussion to email me. The whole idea is to encourage Classroom 2.0 members to connect with each other. So thank you for spending a portion of your day with us. And Jane and Suzie, thanks so much for coming on. It was really
yes, thank you.
Wonderful. And we'll go ahead and sort of formally close, but anybody wants to stick around for a few more minutes can ask questions. And Jane and Suzie, I'll let you decide when you need to log off.
Okay, I would just like to thank everybody too for your really thoughtful questions.
Yes, this is a great group.
This is really wonderful.
So other questions out there, anyone?
My experience has been that people pretty much count on kind of finishing because they have other things to go on to. So if there aren't any questions, don't feel badly. It's just a matter of kind of shifting gears into other things.
Oh, I have to go buy a bed.
There's a project for you, Jane.
Oh, Peggy, that's right. You were there. Peggy was on a tapped-in session. I remember you participating twice, maybe. And you're right. I think this is great. I think it's terrific that Steve and Illuminate are making this platform available to everybody who's who's on Classroom 2.0.
Right, and Peggy, I see you had a comment earlier about needing to model for college students, and I think you're right. If students haven't had a chance to learn this way, really real-world learning, they need to get busy because the real world is right there, on their doorstep. So I think you're exactly right that the sooner they get used to learning this way, the better off they're going to be in the long run, and the more effective they're going to be with whatever it is they want to be doing, getting accomplished.
Well, Jane, maybe you should go buy that bed.
Yeah, it's in my guest room. I have company coming. I really need it. Okay, I'm going to sign off. See you, everyone. Bye.
Okay, good
thanks
work,
so much, everybody. This has been great. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Suzie.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks so much.
You bet.
Bye.
Bye.